Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much, Sten, for the invitation. This is really great to be here today. I'm very, very pleased to share this story with you about what we did at Group Media TFO in the context of blockchain. I bring it to you with no pretense whatsoever. This was an exploratory conversation, it was an exploratory journey, and we are still learning. And trust me, we have still much, much more to learn about how to actually make blockchain work in the real world, because it is still very much a work in progress. Let me just... So, Group Media TFO. Sten says we're a public educational media organization. That's correct. But we're a small public educational media organization. And we operate in Ontario, which, as you know, Canada has two official languages, English and French. But French in Quebec is a majority language. French in Ontario is a minority language. And that's what makes Groupe Media TFO that much more special, in my mind, is that it's not only public, it's not only educational, but it's also pursuing its mission as a broadcaster in a minority language circumstance, which brings all the pressures of dealing in a smaller marketplace and the economics of a smaller marketplace. So Groupe Media TFO was initially a one-channel-to-market television station. And like every other traditional media in North America, I'm told that the viewership to linear media is still quite good here in Estonia. But certainly in North America, traditional linear media has been in decline for quite some time. 7 years ago, that decline brought the board to say we need to do a repositioning, a restructuring of our undertaking to give it a chance to succeed in the new world of digital, and particularly in the new world of changing consumer habits to audiovisual product. So they reached out and they asked me to come in and to lead this charge. And frankly, when I got there, the first lesson I learned was, next time you accept a job, do better due diligence on what you're walking into. Because I was shocked. I was totally taken away by the idea of public educational media in French, but when I got there, it was a bare cupboard. It had great traditional credentials. It had wonderful legacy credentials. In fact, when my two daughters were growing up, we'd make them watch TFO in the morning because it was reliable, quality content, very, very secure, high educational values, very, very well-curated content. So as a parent, very reassuring to put your children in front of that content because it was curriculum-driven, pedagogically very, very solid. But that was back when television was still a major medium. And now parents, teachers, and children were looking at other devices and other screens for that kind of content. But more importantly, what I learned was that the culture of the organization still was very much tied to that analog reality. And while I think a couple of people have already commented on how it is marvelous to see what you have done here in Estonia in taking a country as a whole and transforming your culture to become very digital. And we salute you, and you have a wonderful worldwide reputation in that regard. It still is very hard for a small undertaking, a small company, to make a transition, even though it's on a much smaller scale. And that was, frankly, the biggest challenge I met walking in, which was not resistance because people didn't want to see the future for what it was, but the past was so fundamentally ingrained in how they saw the world and how they saw themselves and how they saw their work as public educational media entrepreneurs. So what we did was we basically tried to bring, as I say, innovation into every conversation. Every conversation in every team, we tried to say innovation has to be, if not spoken, very much present in the ideas that you defend, in the ideas that you challenge, and in the solutions that you're bringing forward. Because if we do not innovate, we will perish. And that's what brought us to blockchain, was the whole idea that if we do not innovate, we will perish. It's flourish or flounder. It's innovate or perish. So in terms of what Groupe Média did in the past 7 years, here's our numbers. We went big time onto digital mobile platforms. We have our presence on 37 social media platforms. We launched YouTube channels. The first year we launched a YouTube channel at Christmas, 2012, we hit 1 million views with our YouTube channel. We were dancing in the street. We couldn't believe it. Educational French language content hits 1 million views. Today we have 24 channels and we have 580 million views to our content. That's an expression of the power of digital. Now I stand here today and I might sound like a hero saying this to you. We had no concept that's what it was going to be like. We had no fucking idea. Let's be clear. It was an uncharted path that we discovered as we went along. So no pretense here. It really was something that we had to acquire as we went along. We developed a platform here called Idelo. Idelo is a subscription-based educational platform for teachers, parents, and students that is free of charge in Ontario because we are in part publicly funded by the Ministry of Education, but that we sell everywhere else. And we sell it across the country, and we're selling it now to international audiences as well. Anyway, in a nutshell, that was the transformation that the team was able to bring by, in some measure, adopting what you folks did here on a countrywide basis, which was thinking digital, making digital culture the everyday language of the conversation, to think that if you don't think digital, you're moving backwards. If you think digital, you have a chance of moving forward. So let's talk blockchain. Innovation, innovate or perish, flounder or flourish or flounder. Well, we saw it as a whole bunch of things initially, but we saw it as a pathway to a new marketplace. Because we received funding in part from, as I say, the Ministry of Education, but we were highly encouraged by our stakeholders and our shareholders to seek other forms of revenue. So we said, wherever there is revenue to be developed, wherever there is potential new business lines that we can tap into, we need to look at that. So I think it was 2.5 years ago, Manuel, we talked about blockchain. I had read a book by 2 Canadians called Blockchain Revolution. Don Tapscott, wonderful visionary, truly a futurist. In fact, he has evangelized the concept of blockchain on every continent on the planet. He and his son done a marvelous job explaining the potential applications across all industries, across all sectors. So when we saw that and we started thinking about it, we said there might be a marketplace for us there. There might be something we can do. There might be something that we could earn some revenue in. But we also saw it as a way forward, again, in this cultural shift in how we saw our business, what we do in terms of creation, what we do in terms of distribution, because we both produce internally our own content, we also acquire from third parties, and then we distribute. And we thought that in blockchain there might be another way of looking at both production, distribution, and a marketplace as a mindset. And in fact, I would say today, more than anything else, I believe that blockchain is a mindset, much more than anything else. It's all about, and it's been said a number of times here today, but I'll say it in my way, it comes down to how you see your relationship with those with whom you transact. If you want to see it with less intermediaries, less friction, you see it in a world of blockchain applications. If you continue to see it through status quo filters that have intermediaries and more friction, well then that's not going to take you down a blockchain path. So you've all heard about what a blockchain is, and I'm not going to bore you with it again, but it really is a ledger. It really is a platform that's distributed, and it really is something that is unique because it gives access to a whole bunch of people at the same time to view transactions, realities, unfolding in real-time data on how things are doing. Of course, there are permissioned and permissionless, and you've heard about that too, so I'm not going to bore you with that. For us, when we looked at blockchain as a business, as a way to create a marketplace and to monetize content, we saw the shared ledger as this distributed system of record sharing. That means, and you've heard various variations on that theme today, but it's across a business network. We saw it, and we focused on the business applications. And think about the context where you're operating today. And if you are sharing information in your business realities with the parties that you are involved with, on a regular basis, imagine the different culture that you would bring to the way you transact with those parties. That's the reality of a shared ledger. The smart contract. All the smart contract is taking the way you do business today and finding a way of registering it on the distributed ledger to simplify it. And I'll come back to that later and you'll see what I mean. The whole idea of permissions. So when we look at an enterprise blockchain as opposed to a public blockchain, think of an enterprise blockchain as a club. How many people here are members of a club or have been? You become a member, you agree to certain rules. Membership entails that you might pay dues. You might have certain privileges. You might not have certain privileges if you don't pay more dues, et cetera, et cetera. You get to use facilities. At a tennis club, you've got to book your court 3 days in advance, a week in advance. All of these are rules. These are matters of governance. Permissions are like governance matters. It's basically rules. And I think it was Jake who said it earlier. It means that the whole transparency notion is based on the rules that apply to you as a participant in an ecosystem. You don't get access to everything, but you get access to what matters to you. And that's why you're a member, because there's a return for you in being a member. Finally, the consensus. That, again, is fundamental to the governance model. Again, I'll come back to my example of a club. I was a member of a tennis club a number of years ago, and there was a great big kerfuffle around some matter between the members, and people were bitching and screaming, and we said, well, listen, there's only one way to do this. You go to the AGM and you change the rules. And to do that, you have to bring other people on board to see your point of view. If you don't get enough people to go with your view, the rules will stay the way they are. That's really what consensus is about. So, what did we come up with? We came up with an idea that basically came down to this. We said we are producers, we are a party that acquires, and then we distribute audiovisual content. It happens to be educational in our context, but let's try to vision a model that talks about all forms of content that is audiovisual. So let's try to make clear financial information available relating to rights holders, revenue, and distribution. Let's try to create this decentralized ledger that provides trustworthy, accurate, and available information. And the trust issue has been mentioned a number of times today, but I heard something the other day that rang true and false to me. And it said something like this, and I'll try to paraphrase. It's not mine, it's somebody else's, and I wish I could remember who it was, but I can't. It said that basically internet digitized accessible information, shared information, and that blockchain would digitize confidence and trust. Well, if blockchain digitizes confidence and trust, we still have a lot more work to do. It holds the promise of that, in my view. The very real promise, but we're not there yet. Third, that the new platforms would enhance funding for investors. Key, you don't get content done without funding. Fourth, creating digital identities to establish a credible, reputable system for producers and consumers. And 5, removing intermediaries, reducing delays, fees, audit processes, i.e. friction. Taking as much friction as possible out of the transactions, out of the business that you're involved in. So we said if we could come up with a concept that would do all of that as a prototype, that certainly would advance our understanding of it, but it would also be interesting for the industry. So we went to the Canadian Media Fund with an application in their experimental envelope, funding envelope, and they awarded a grant to us to assist in the financing of building this prototype. So the prototype that we created thought about the matter of audiovisual works as an arc. So imagine from the moment that you have an idea to develop, and we'll call it a film for today. Let's say that Sten and Stéphane got together and they said, we got a great idea for a film. Or I think you were talking about Helen doing films. So you've got a great idea for a film this afternoon. You can be a co-producer too, Stéphane. And the idea from its inception then had to go through all the various steps to get it into production, into distribution, and ultimately into theaters and in front of publics. Publics in various audience segments, be they cinema publics, streaming publics, all sorts of publics, all sorts of audiences. All the transactions that would be involved in that from the point of view, from the moment that you had the idea to the end use. How do we capture all of those transactions? How do we create a system, a ledger, that would capture all that? So that's what we tried to do, and here you have it. So the circle in the middle represents the film I was just describing. On the left of the film are what I'll call the inputs. So if you look, you'll see a logo of RBC, happens to be my banker, Royal Bank of Canada, the financial institutions. In that square, please imagine public funders, private funders, anybody who takes an interest in funding an audiovisual work, in this instance, a film. Below that, you could possibly do an ICO, as Jake was suggesting earlier, to bring people into the funding model as well. On the upper side, on the left, you have the various contracts that you would require with the production elements that go into the film. The second one in the TFOs at the top is a producer, just as a notion, the personnel that's attached to that. Unifor is one of the national unions that we deal with. We have two unions in our shop, Uniform and the Canadian Guild of Media Employees. So we have a collective agreement with Unifor now. If we were to produce Sten, Stéphane, and Helen's movie, we would deal with Unifor. Now, we're not saying that the smart contract, I'd like to come back to that comment I made earlier, is a brand new deal. We have a collective agreement. Trust me, we don't want to renegotiate a collective agreement every time a new film comes up. But what we want to do is translate its reality into a smart contract language so that it can be registered on the blockchain and so that it can produce the consequences that the blockchain allows for as a decentralized ledger as the film gets produced, distributed, and used, and as payments start coming back. And as people who are participants in that blockchain can view in real time the performance of the audiovisual work, where it's been distributed, who's using it, what its audience share is, what its audience share isn't, et cetera, et cetera. On the right side of the circle, you have the various players that go from the media aggregators handling licensing in the physical media. In the middle is the media aggregator handling licensing in the broadcasting media. And then streaming media. And then, of course, you've got all examples of where that product could end up in various jurisdictions, whether it's France, Canada, the EU, Amazon, 2.tv, or Netflix. So we said, if that is our universe, and that's a prototype representation of the contracts that would be involved in the idea, the funding, the production, the distribution, and the use of that, let's do a market simulation. So once we had that built, we called on industry partners, producers, unions, funders, academics, distributors, and we said, please come and play with the model and tell us what's wrong, or tell us what's right if you want. And so over the course of 2 months, we ran market simulation of the prototype, and received wonderful feedback. Some good, lots critical, but all very helpful to improve and to bonify the model. And so we walked away from that exercise with the clear understanding that we had something real, because enough people participated in it from enough representative groups of the various players that are on that chart, that we knew we had a critical mass of feedback that gave the prototype real substance. So what were the lessons that we learned? First, that the processes that we mapped out matched the industry players' requirements. And where they didn't match their requirements or their interests, we got some real feedback to address some of the shortcomings. This was a very interesting finding. The project helped us identify tax credit fundings as a critical and complex component of cultural audiovisual production funding. So I just want to stop there for a moment. Jake said earlier that most of the production in the US is privately financed. True, accept that. Go into every film and find me a film that doesn't have a tax credit production attached to it. Because every jurisdiction in the Western world is trying to attract crews to come and do movies in their jurisdiction. And how do they do that? They do it with production tax credits. But what we found was, when we were doing our market simulation, is that the public agency funders who participated in the market simulation, the feedback was, this is wonderful. There are shortcomings. You'd have to address this, you'd have to fix this, you'd have to fix that. Sure, but this is wonderful. Not only does it give us real-time, granular transparency on how the financial picture of that audiovisual work is performing now, as opposed to 25 minutes ago, but moreover, you can take a whole bunch of administrative complexities out of the equation for us that burden our operation in doing production tax credits. So that was like a major aha moment. And the aha was, well, what do we do about that? Next point, it also helps the copyright agencies to reinvent themselves and optimize their operations. Your copyright collectives here in Europe, the copyright collectives in North America, have done a marvelous job on a whole bunch of levels. But fundamentally, they are arcane systems that need to be thrown out and reinvented. And the blockchain is perfect for that. They should do it themselves, or others will do it for them. I would predict to you that it won't be long that somebody like Spotify is going to come around and going to say, I can handle that job for you. I've got the data right here, and I know how much is being played. I'll figure out how much to pay the rights owners. The disruptors will continue to disrupt, and some disruptors will disrupt the disrupted. So that for sure is a lesson we learned. The last lesson, and listen, there were many, but these are the major ones, the traceability and the immutability of every transaction support the resolution of legal disputes. I'm a lawyer by training, and Prit has left, I'm sorry, but this is very good news for parties and transactions, very bad news for lawyers, because it takes out a whole lot of disputes that needn't happen because you've clarified things by way of smart contracts. Doesn't mean to say there won't be some legal disputes. There will always be some. But it takes a whole lot of them potentially out of the mix. So, back to Group Media TFO. So now what the hell do we do with this? We're a public educational media enterprise. What do we do with blockchain? So we said, we sure have learned a lot. We sure know that there is a market that will unequivocally emerge in our space at some point in time in the not too distant future. Is this part of the solution? Maybe. So we did an RFP, a request for proposals to blockchain accelerators. We received a bunch of proposals. We were in discussion with one, and we're currently sitting in a kind of a static position, and we now have conversations with others. The bottom line is we are trying to find a party who can take our IP, take our know-how, and take it to market, because we do not have the resources. I can promise you that on my management team, and there are some really smart people that work with me, but none of them are in the business of blockchain accelerator take-to-market strategies. And even though I've done a lot of business stuff over my career, I don't have that experience either. I love learning about it, but I've got other things to do to meet the charge of my job. So that's where we're landed on this. But I want to come back to one thing that I believe was mentioned a few times today, but I'd like to give it a little bit of a different angle. Blockchain, and I'll be an evangelist here for a moment, not the Baptist evangelist on American TV, Jake, but blockchain evangelist. It strikes me that blockchain has the potential to do a whole bunch of things across a whole bunch of sectors in ways that are going to serve democracy, fundamentally. We're talking about it here in the context of media. Others have talked about it in the context of other things. But it is truly, perhaps, one of those things that will bring the internet and the connectivity that results from the internet back to procuring the democratic outcomes that the people like Tim Berners-Lee had in mind when they created World Wide Web, which have since been centralized and galvanized into the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons and their remarkable centralization power, including their centralization power on data, which speaks to the whole questions I have about how to deal with the artificial intelligence revolution and robotics revolution that we will live with in the coming future, very short and medium term, knowing that those big players have so much control and so much ability to dictate how the algorithms that interpret that data are built, are trained, and on what biases. Because as somebody said, algorithms are wonderful things, but they can also be, I think it was Cathy O'Neill who calls herself the math babe. She said, I think that algorithms can also be weapons of math destruction. Clever little work, but not to be lost on you. Anyway, coming back to blockchain and my evangelism. I honestly believe this is going to happen. It's going to happen sooner than later. But to happen, it requires creating circumstances that allow it to happen, more importantly, that incentivize parties to make it happen. And what is holding back media now, Jake, I think, in part, are enough incentives. I think if you're a producer of a film, you have to think hard about, do I really want to get into this whole blockchain dance? Like, I've got enough on my plate already just to make it successful, creatively, financing, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where the public funding agencies come back into play. To my mind, there is a way to create an incentive for producers who have access to public funding mechanisms to continue to have access by asking them, requesting, subjecting them to becoming blockchain productions, providing that the blockchain productions procure results and outcomes that are in the public interest. And I have nothing against the private sector. I've spent all my career in the private sector. I've only been in the public sector for the past 7 years. And without a strong private sector, nothing will get done in the public sector. But I do believe that there are ways to do that, to create incentives that would produce public sector outcomes that would not disincentivize the private players from working with them too. So that's my personal evangelism about it. I think that it's going to happen. I think it'll happen sooner, only if measures in the way of incentives are adopted to push players into a position where they say, if I don't do this, I'm losing an advantage that I otherwise would have had. So why don't I take advantage of that opportunity? So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate your attention. Hope that I was helpful to you.